I just want to say one thing about the fact that there's not that many men in the room. Now, I appreciate and understand that women have been at the foundation, both of Center for Domestic Peace support, but also more broadly, and I'm going to talk about that in a few moments. I really am going to talk about women's leadership and advocacy, and not just locally, but globally on domestic violence and a whole range of other issues. But I have to say, one of the goals I think we should have is if we really want to be transformative, if we really want to not have to be listening to story after story after story after story from women and girls, both here in the United States, crossing class, race, ethnicity, socioeconomics, and every other category, we need more men in these kind of rooms. We need more men who are willing to say, this is not just, I'm going to go because my spouse or my colleague wants me to go, but more men who want to say, I want to be here. I want to be in this room. I want to be a member of my community who takes a stand like those of you who are in this room take a stand. Now, I appreciate there are men in the room. I'm not, I understand that. But I have to say, as a man doing this work, and I've been doing this for a long time, right? It's sometimes uncomfortable for me, and I can speak for a lot of other men who do this kind of work, when we get congratulated for doing work that men should be doing. Now, I understand and appreciate that it's good to acknowledge men's participation and men's leadership and men's financial support. All of that is, absolutely, I'm on board with that. But we shouldn't be congratulated for just doing what decent people should be doing and what good men should be doing. Don't you think? My friend and colleague Michael Kimmel has a phrase to describe this. He calls it premature congratulation. We need more follow-through. Now, I want to share with you a paradigm-shifting way of thinking about domestic violence, but also sexual harassment, sexual assault, the sexual abuse of children, and that whole range of issues that I'll refer to in shorthand as gender violence issues. They've historically been seen as women's issues that some good men help out with. And even in 2018, after all these years of activism and of consciousness raising and of incredible work on the ground here and all over, so many people still think of these issues as fundamentally women's issues that some good men help out with. I have a big problem with that frame, and I don't accept the premise. In fact, I'm going to argue that these are men's issues, first and foremost. Now, having said that, let me say I also understand, of course, that these are women's issues. I mean, of course, women are profoundly affected on every level, personally, professionally, politically. I mean, obviously, women are directly impacted. But even more than that, women's leadership on these matters has been utterly transformative, both locally and globally. Utterly transformative. Women's contributions, like the Center for Domestic Peace, formerly Marin Abused Women's Services, and analogs around the United States and other parts of the world, have been at the front edge of a cultural revolution, and it continues all over the world in incredible transformations that are happening. Men had been beating women and abusing women in relationships, in marriages, in families, for thousands of years. This isn't decades, this is thousands of years, but it wasn't until the 1970s that there was such a thing as a battered women's program, a domestic violence program. There weren't 800 numbers to call for victims and survivors. There weren't trained counselors in communities and on college campuses to address the needs of victims and survivors. None of that architecture of support that so many of us today take for granted. And by the way, so many people around the world can't take it for granted because the services that we have available, not just in Marin County, but in the United States, are way beyond the services available in most of the rest of the world for victims and survivors. And there are countries, including in wealthy countries in Europe and other places, where the level of support, the level of services is pathetic compared to what you would think for wealthy countries in the 21st century. I'm not talking about just the developing world. I'm talking about Europe and other wealthy parts of the world where the services are really under-resourced and way behind, all right? But all the services and all the accountability that we have for offenders today that we didn't have back in the day, and to the extent that we have prevention programming, the prevention program that we have, all of this is as a result of women's leadership. Women coming together, again, in a multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic sense back in the 70s, here in the States and elsewhere. And they had male allies, but not that many. But they came together and said, we need services for victims and survivors. We need the state to fund these programs. We need programs for men. We need offender accountability. We need to train law enforcement. All that stuff has a result of women's advocacy and leadership. And it wouldn't have happened without it. And you know, there's a big misconception, among many misconceptions, of women's leadership and advocacy in all of this. And by the way, it's not a finished project. I'm not saying that we have everything we need or that the job is done. That's not the case. But you know, we've made a lot of progress. But one of the misconceptions that people have about women's advocacy and leadership in these matters is that they think that somehow women and girls have benefited. Sure, good. But men and boys, not so much. You know, men and boys, we're just kind of floating out there, and we need more help, we need more services, we need more attention, which I agree with, by the way. We do need more attention to the needs of boys and men and everything else. I agree with that. And there's some people who actually believe that as women have advanced, men have been somehow disadvantaged. Like it's a zero-sum game, and that if you make progress for women, somehow men are going to be hurt by this. This is a ridiculous point of view. Let me just say that out loud. It's a ridiculous point of view. I'm sorry, that's the men's rights argument, if you hadn't heard it before. I'm over-dramatizing it a little bit, but I mean, give me a break. Really? But I think that most people aren't bought into that level of ignorance and backlash sentiment. I think most people just think, well, men and boys haven't really been affected, and yeah, we need to spend some time in paying attention to men and boys. Well, I want to say something. Yes, we do need to pay attention to men and boys, but the idea that men and boys haven't benefited from women's advocacy and leadership is nonsense. Men and boys' lives have profoundly improved as a result of women's leadership and advocacy in the domestic violence movement and the sexual assault movement. I could spend the whole afternoon, honestly I don't have that time, but I could spend the whole afternoon talking about how men and boys' lives have benefited from women's leadership in this movement, in this work. And I'm happy that Center for Domestic Peace has had this long-time relationship with Mankind and Man Alive and all these other incredible organizations, Steve and others here in Marin. This is a good thing. This is a great thing. It's not that common, to be honest, to have a women's-led organization having a long-time positive relationship with men activists in the community. That's a great model. It's a great thing. But because of time constraints, I just want to give you a little bit of an example of what I'm talking about in terms of how men have benefited. And let me just say, I'm guessing that a lot of women in this room have men in your lives. Is that a safe assumption? And a lot of you have husbands, fathers, sons, male colleagues, and friends, right? I know that. I mean, it's obvious, right? So let's take one example of how men have benefited. Let's talk about domestic violence and its effects on children, okay? This is a conversation that we've been having in the field increasingly over the past 20 years. We didn't just start yesterday. We're talking about it for at least 20 years, right? And there's a term that some people have used to describe children who are growing up in homes where they're exposed to, quote, domestic violence. It's called children who witness domestic violence. And sometimes people will shorthand that to say children who witness. Have you heard this term? This is a term that I don't like and I don't use. You know why? Because if you're a 7-year-old kid cowering in the closet as your father or another man is raging against your mother, you're not a witness. You're a victim. You're not observing something happening to somebody else. You're experiencing it happening to yourself. The experience of trauma is much more immediate and profound than is suggested by the passive word witness. Well, guess what? The category of children who are being traumatized in this way includes not just girls, but also boys. Do you have any idea how many boys in the state of California are right now in the juvenile system, in part because their life journey started out as traumatized boys in families, and they didn't know how to take another path than the traditional path that we give to boys who have been thusly traumatized, which is somebody took something from me, I'm going to take it from somebody else, which is why boys who have been abused are something like 10 times more likely to become abusive of others than boys who have not been abused. The prison system in the state of California and every other state is filled with chronologically adult men who, underneath the bluster and the tatted up bodies and the badass attitude, are little boys emotionally, many of whom were wounded as little boys, and they developed this self-defensive reaction, armored up, and if they did bad things to abuse others, I'm not defending it. Let me just make that clear. We Homo sapiens have big enough brains that we can hold in our head 2, sometimes 3 thoughts at the same time, which is to say we can hold individuals accountable for their behavior, and we can take a step back and ask, what are we doing in our society, in the socialization of boys, and the definitions of manhood and femininity, and the definitions of womanhood and all that? What are we doing such that we are producing these predictable outcomes generation after generation? What can we do about that? How can we change the socialization of boys and girls? How can we be more sort of connected and hold individuals accountable? And I say this, and I'm saying it with, obviously, passion, because there's been such an impoverished discourse in this society about crime and punishment for so long that any time you try to come up with explanations and understanding of why so much violence is going on, why so many boys and men are acting out in these ways, you're then accused of making defense. You're defending abusive behavior. What about personal responsibility? And all that kind of anti-intellectual nonsense, which shuts down thoughtful debate and dialogue about the causes of all this violence. So much of it is unnecessary, you understand? I mean, so much of the violence is unnecessary if we were doing better as a society, institutionally, culturally, in the way that we transmit values to the next generation, the media. I mean, if we were doing better, we wouldn't have all these problems. And yet the attempt to even talk about those larger forces gets shouted down as, you're making excuses. No, and so I'm just going to say for the record, I'm not making excuses. I'm trying to understand. I think we all need to try to understand what is going on in the lives of boys and young men that cause some of them to act out in these ways, and how can we change that? How can we intervene on that process? It seems like a basic good, if you will, goal. And by the way, let me just say, if we're going to change the system of mass incarceration, which is a disgrace internationally, and it doesn't just destroy individuals, it destroys families, communities, and the larger society is dramatically affected in very negative ways by the system of mass incarceration. We do have to talk about racism, and we do have to talk about poverty, because those are two giant systems that have everything to do with who ends up in the system. But we also have to talk about violence done to boys and young men, because so much of the bad behavior in our society and in the world that's done by boys and men has some of its roots in violence done to boys and men in childhood and adolescence. Feminist theorists and activists in the DV movement and elsewhere have been talking about this for decades, that we have to make connections between what happens in the private sphere of the family and the public sphere, that it's a false dichotomy. There's all sorts of dialectical or interrelated factors in families and in community. There's so many ways that what happens within the family bleeds out into the rest of society. I could go on and on about those connections. I just want to give you, again, for the purpose of this presentation, one example: mass shootings, mass killings, which is pathetically common in the United States, right? We know this. And again, those of you who have traveled internationally know that people around the world think we're just barbarians in the United States, at how much violence we do to each other, and how much mass killings are just a normal part of the news cycle, as opposed to some of these countries where they have a mass killing and they have a shutdown of the whole country. And they're like, after having these national days of introspection, what happened to us? We have a mass shooting. Meanwhile, in our country, it's like a 24-hour news cycle or 48-hour news cycle, right? Mass shootings. You know what the connection is to domestic violence? There was a study done by the Huffington Post about a year ago of the past 10 years of mass shootings in the United States, and it showed that 57% of the mass shootings have a domestic violence connection, which is to say the perpetrator of these mass shootings, including school shootings, is either the perpetrator or the victim of domestic violence. So how are we going to talk about preventing mass killings and not talk about domestic violence? There's so many other examples of the relationship between domestic violence and sexual assault and other phenomena that people don't necessarily associate that with. And I think some of the work in our field, in our movement over the coming years, is we have to be even bolder in making the connections for people between what we know and what we know happens in these families and what we know that happens in these relationships, and then how that affects everything else, from gang violence to drug and alcohol problems to homelessness to on and on and on. You follow me? It's all connected. So yes, we need to take care of victims and survivors, and Center for Domestic Peace is obviously exemplary in that context. But if we have a broader vision about how we need to transform the society that produces the abuse and the victimization, then we have a social change model that's broader than just delivery of services. And I think, again, Center for Domestic Peace has been at the forefront of trying to combine those two, being a social activist organization as well as a delivery of services to people who immediately need help and support. Isn't that true? Which is a great thing. Now, I also want to argue, I've been saying that we need to have this paradigm shift, right? That seeing these issues as women's issues that good men help out with is the old paradigm. We need to leave that behind and move on. We have to start seeing these as men's issues. And by the way, some people will say, why do you have to say men's issues, women's issues? And we also know that that's a gender binary that's confining. There's a broader spectrum of gender than is suggested by men and women. There's people who are gender nonconforming. There's a spectrum. But why do you have to even use gender terms? And my argument is, if you don't use the term, if you don't say it's a men's issue, if you say it's a human rights issue, it's a public health issue, it's a social justice issue, men are still going to tune it out. Men are still going to say, it's not really me. Human rights, yeah, good, it's my, but I'm not really, that's not really my thing. But if you say it's a men's issue, then you get men's attention in a way that you wouldn't have. I'm telling you, this is how it works. And I work with men all over the world, and in every setting you can imagine, and you got to just say it right straight up. This is a men's issue. And not just that, though. It's a leadership issue for men. Because this is really about leadership. And what does that mean? It means if you're a man or you're in a position of leadership, and I mean cultural, political, professional, business, leadership can be broadly defined, or you're a young man and you aspire to leadership, then you need to know about all of this. You need to know about how pervasive the problems of sexual harassment, domestic violence, sexual assault are in the lives of women and girls, but also in men and boys. You need to know the connections between domestic violence and sexual assault and a whole range of other social problems like I've referenced. And then you need to figure out how you can, within your sphere of influence, support victims and survivors of this abuse, how you can challenge and interrupt abusive behavior around you and hold offenders accountable, but more broadly, how can you use whatever influence you have within your sphere of influence to make sure that the abuse doesn't happen in the first place? Not because you're a nice guy helping out the women, but because you're a leader, and we expect that of our leaders in the 21st century. If we could get to the place, yes. If we could get to the place where men and young men aspiring to leadership knew that part of the expectation of a 21st century leader in the community, in the society, was that you had to know all this and do all this, the change that needs to happen would happen much more quickly. Because there's an awful lot of good men out there and in here. There's an awful lot of good men who have enormous influence, power, mentorship opportunity, who haven't used it on these issues because it's not really my thing. It's it's kind of a women's thing. It's like, I support my wife and I write a check and that's good, but that's not really my thing. So that's got to change, don't you think? And if that changes, like I said, the other changes that'll happen will happen much more quickly. Now, some of you might be wondering why we have this thing up here, and the easel with a flip chart. And I say this for the younger folks in the room. This is an easel, and this is a flip chart. And this is a magic marker. And I don't care how close to Silicon Valley we are, this technology has not been improved upon for certain things. For certain things. All right? I'm not naive about the limitations of the technology, okay? You can't click it and send it to Mumbai, I understand. But I'm going to share with you, I would like to share with you, the basic underlying premise of the bystander approach, which I'm one of the architects of. And the reason why I'm doing that is because it gives everybody, conceptually and practically, a way to think about how everybody can play a constructive role in challenging and interrupting abuse and supporting victims and survivors. And I say everybody, women and men, obviously, everybody has a role to play. And so I just wanted to share that with you before I wrap up. The board seemed to make sense, to me at least, to illustrate a point that I wanted to make. Now, back in the, not a very good magic marker. I'm going to illustrate the bystander approach with a very brief overview of the history behind it, okay? And some of you probably heard of bystander intervention, and it's mandated in all 50 states now in legislation for programming on college campuses and elsewhere, bystander intervention. So I'm one of, like I said, the architects of this approach. So here's the mini history. Back in the 1970s and 80s, which is, I know, for the younger people here, really ancient history. I appreciate, it's like, my 16-year-old son, I reference the 70s and 80s. It's like I might as well, when I was his age, somebody be referencing the 40s and 50s, which immediately shut me, it's like black and white TV, But anyway, 70s and 80s isn't really that long ago for some of us. Is it? It's shocking how not that long ago it is, but when you think about it, it is kind of long ago. But anyways, back in the 70s and 80s, when people I'm going to use sexual assault prevention, but we can talk about DV prevention, but when people on college campuses were doing what they called sexual assault prevention, back in the 70s and 80s, it was organized around this binary understanding, women and men. Most efforts that were called prevention efforts focused on women and young women, and they weren't really prevention efforts. They were risk reduction efforts under the name of prevention. So women and girls were taught, don't put your drink down at a party because a guy might drop a rape drug in your drink. Look in the back seat of your car before you get in. Have a man's voice on the voicemail, although back in the day there was no voicemail. It was answering machines. But it would be like if you have buddy system, if you have, if you're going to be drinking alcohol with a group of people, make sure that you know who your friends are with and who they're going home with and all this kind of stuff, right? This is all still to this day, everybody who has daughters teaches them these kinds of things, urban, suburban, and rural areas, and many of you, and the women in this room, know exactly, you have a mental checklist on a daily basis. It's important, but it's not prevention, it's risk reduction. Again, there's a distinction. True prevention means going to the root cause of the problem, and women and girls are not the root cause of the sexual assault problem. Back in the day when men and boys were focused on, it was almost always as perpetrators or potential perpetrators. So the spirit of the educational message to guys was, you better listen up, you better know the law, you better know the rules, you better know the definition of sexual consent, especially involving alcohol in the state of California. And if you're with somebody and you're pushing and you don't know if they're fully consenting and you continue, then you could be crossing the line into becoming a rapist, and you need to back off. The problem with going into a room with that attitude towards men is that a lot of men will shut you down and shut you out. And they'll say, who are you talking to me like this for? I'm not a rapist, I'm not an abuser. I resent the implication that just because I happen to share the same secondary sex characteristics with the majority of perpetrators that I'm somehow implicated in their abuses. And a lot of guys will just shut you down. And a lot of guys will say in response to all these issues, they'll say, these are important issues, but they're not my issues. I'm a good guy. I don't hurt women. Have you heard men say this? This is what most men say, you understand? I'm a good guy, this isn't my issue. And can I just give you a response, if you hear that from somebody in the future, a way to respond to it? You can say, you know what, I think we need to raise the bar a little higher for what it means to be a good guy in the United States in 2018. And just saying I'm not a rapist is not particularly impressive to me. We need so much more from men than that. But my problem as a young activist back in the day, back in the late Mesozoic, when I was a college student and student thereafter, was how do we get more men involved in this? That's been my life's work. How do we get more men in standing with women? How do we get more white people to challenge racism? How do we get more heterosexual people to stand with people across the LGBTQ spectrum? In other words, people with social position and authority and privilege, how can we get them to help and support and work towards the just society that they claim to care about? But my main focus has been men's violence against women. So my question was, how was I going to get more men involved? And I ended up working in the sports culture. This is, again, a very shorthand. I worked in the sports culture. I created my program, the MVP program, which was the first of its kind in the professional sports culture, in the college athletic world, with the intent of using the power and platform of athletes in their peer culture and beyond the insular athletic subculture to make the changes that have to happen. In other words, my thinking wasn't that we have a problem in athletics, we're going to fix it. It's that we have a problem in our society and in the world. Athletics plays an important role in the socialization of children, and there's an awful lot of young men, for example, on college campuses and high schools who have an awful lot of social capital, like I did when I was a young guy, and how do we use that constructively to speak out on these issues and open up space for others? That was my thinking. So I was a young grad student in Boston in the early 90s, and I approached the director of this sports institute to create my idea was to create a model program to train initially college male student athletes to speak out on the issues of domestic and sexual violence and harassment and gay bashing and bullying. And we got funded by the United States Department of Education under different leadership to create a model program that would engage men. And so the question is, we had this great opportunity. We had 9 colleges and universities, starting with big Division I programs like Nebraska and Kentucky, all the way to small liberal arts colleges in New England. The question is, what are we going to say to these young men on college football, basketball, baseball, hockey, lacrosse, soccer, wrestling teams? What are we going to say to these young men that invites them into the conversation rather than indicts them as potential rapists and abusers? And I say invite rather than indict, which is a quote from Esther Solar, the founder of Futures Without Violence, right down the street. The reason why this was why it was invite rather than indict was because so many guys have felt, and fairly and unfairly, that all of this kind of talk, all this kind of activism is anti-male, it's like bashing men, it's focusing on all the negatives in men. And my goal was to try to inspire men and young men to like be part of the positive change that has to happen. And to get buy-in, you don't want to go in with your finger pointed, stop doing it. You want something else. And at the time, I had a professor in graduate school who, along with his colleagues, was looking at an approach to middle school bullying prevention that moved beyond the perpetrator-victim binary. In other words, they were focusing not on the kid doing the bullying and the kid experiencing it, but all the kids around the kid doing it and all the kids around the kid experiencing it. The goal was to get kids around the kid doing it, to make it clear to that kid that what he or she was doing was not okay. Not because they were going to get in trouble with the authority figures, like the principal or the teacher who was going to come in as an external agent of authority into the peer culture and remove the offending party, but because the peer culture was going to police itself. Because kids were going to make it clear, you can't treat kids like this. This is not okay. And we don't respect this kind of behavior. And you're not impressing us. And you've got some issues. And the goal was to get kids around the kid experiencing the bullying, to make it clear to that kid that what's going on is wrong, we don't appreciate it, and we don't want to know, we want you to know that we'll do whatever we can to support you and to help you. And they called that the bystander approach. And the beauty of it is that everybody had a role to play, because everybody is in peer cultures and in friendship circles and on teams and in workplaces. Everybody has social, well, not everybody, but most people have social lives and social communities. And the best thing about it for men was that it gave us a way to talk to men without talking to them, you better stop doing abuse. It's more like you need to start challenging and interrupting abusive behavior around you, and not just, by the way, at the point of attack, because that's another really important point that I think we have to conceptualize. So the first concept is the bystander, right? In other words, not the perpetrator or the victim, but the bystander. And the bystander is a synonym. Don't let it confuse you. It's a synonym for friend, teammate, classmate, colleague, coworker, family member. A bystander is just anybody who's in a given peer culture or community or network or family who's not directly involved in a particular situation of harassment or abuse. And I know that time is not my ally. I get the nonverbal cues really well. It's one of the things about experience as a speaker. You know that when the master or mistress of ceremonies starts walking up, she doesn't have to say anything. But I'll get through this. I'll try to do this in unbelievable lightning round fashion. If you can imagine this triangle as a pyramid, and you can imagine the tip of the pyramid is an incident of abuse, it's an incident of harassment, it's gay bashing, it's bullying, it's domestic violence. That's the tip. But the base of the pyramid is a set of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that create the cultural context and foundation within which the abusive act takes place. It opens up a lot more space for what we're saying a bystander needs to do. So what I'm saying is, we don't just need somebody, or young people, or older people, to, when you see a domestic violence incident, you need to go in and intervene and stop it. Or when you see a sexual assault in progress, you need to intervene and stop it. That's not realistic, number one, because most times it takes place behind closed doors. But it's also not a superhero approach that I'm talking about. It's about how do you carry yourself 24/7? How do you make it clear to people around you that you're not going to tolerate bullying behavior, abusive behavior in any form? The hard work takes place down here. The hard work doesn't take place like when you see a domestic violence incident or a sexual assault incident, intervene. I mean, that's hard. I'm not saying it isn't hard. But the harder work is the subtle stuff that happens on a day-to-day basis. And for men, for example, one of the challenges is not when you see your guy friend beating up his girlfriend. It's when you're hanging out with a group of guys and one or two of the guys start making sexist comments and degrading comments about women. What do you say when you see that? And if you don't say something, what are you saying? If you're a white person and you have a group of white people hanging out and there's a couple of white people making racist and degrading comments about people of color and you don't say something, what are you saying? And don't we know that attitudes influence actions? Don't we know that attitudes influence actions? The last thing I'll say, and I appreciate your indulgence and I'll get off the stage, is people will often say, if boys or male children are not born genetically predetermined or predestined to be violent, then it must be learned behavior, right? You'll hear people say that. And you know what, I don't like saying learned behavior. You know why? Because it's too passive. Because everything that's learned is also taught. So I'd rather say it's taught behavior. And the question is, by the way, by shifting from learned behavior to taught behavior, it shifts the onus of responsibility onto those of us who are teaching boys and men, and girls and women, what it means to be a man or a woman. And everybody has a role to play in that. Everybody has a role to play in that. And so I think we have to, all of us, think about how are we, in our day-to-day lives, in our personal lives, and in our professional lives, and in our community lives, how are we playing a constructive role in teaching boys and men how to be men in ways that are not abusive, that challenge and interrupt abuse when they see it, and stand for justice, because it takes strength to stand for justice. Let me just say that. We're not talking about making boys into weak, soft people. We're saying standing for justice takes strength and courage, doesn't it? So, and what can we say to our daughters in terms of teaching them not only just how to be strong, but how when they see injustice around them, how do they stand for justice, and how do they challenge and interrupt abuse? Because what we're teaching them and imparting to them is what they're acting out. And the media culture is a big part of the challenge that those of us who are parents and adults have to navigate. The sports culture, there's so many forces, the social media, the technologies of communication that are changing everything. Everything, it's not an easy thing, what I'm saying. It's not an easy thing. But when has social change ever been easy? And is it anywhere near as hard as it was for Donna and her colleagues back in the 70s from scratch, creating a whole movement? We have so much to stand on, the shoulders of giants we have to stand on to do this work going forward. I hope I've given you some ideas about what to do. Good luck and thank you.